Welcome to the Old Roads Podcast, a podcast that seeks to bring the wisdom of the past to the challenges of the present. I'm your host, Aaron O'Kelly. I'm a pastor and a theological educator. Throughout August, we've been looking at the topic of authority, and that raises an interesting question here to conclude that discussion today. Should Christians ever resist authority? Is there a Christian resistance theory? Actually, there are multiple Christian resistance theories that have been propounded throughout church history, and it's understandable why, because there are numerous biblical examples of resistance to authority, examples that are praised in the Bible. So, for example, we read in Exodus chapter 1, verses 15 to 21, "Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, 'When you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him, but if it is a daughter, she shall live.' But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, 'Why have you done this? And let the male children live.' The midwives said to Pharaoh, 'Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them.' So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families." So you have here an example of resistance to authority where the Hebrew midwives did not obey the Pharaoh's command, which was a command to commit murder. They were to murder male Hebrew children when they delivered them. The Hebrew midwives refused to do that, and they even deceived the Pharaoh about their refusal to do it, and God honored them and rewarded them for their faithfulness. In Joshua 2, verses 2 to 7, we have a similar situation where Joshua sends spies ahead of him to the city of Jericho, and those two Hebrew spies are searching out the land and particularly the city to see about its defenses because the Israelites are getting ready to come and take it over. And verse 2 says, "And it was told the king of Jericho, 'Behold, men of Israel have come here tonight to search out the land.' Then the king of Jericho sent to Rahab, the one in whose house these two men were staying. So he sent to Rahab, saying, 'Bring out the men who have come to you, who entered your house, for they have come to search out all the land.' But the woman had taken the two men and hidden them. And she said, 'True, the men came to me, but I did not know where they were from. And when the gate was about to be closed at dark, the men went out. I do not know where the men went. Pursue them quickly, for you will overtake them.' But she had brought them up to the roof and hid them with the stalks of flax that she had laid in order on the roof. So the men pursued after them on the way to the Jordan as far as the fords, and the gate was shut as soon as the pursuers had gone out." Rahab hid the spies and deceived the king about where they were, the king of Jericho, her own king. So similar to the midwives, she deceived her king and protected God's people. She's praised for that. She's an example in the Old Testament of faith. James mentions her as one whose works demonstrated her faith because she was hereby aligning herself with the God of Israel. So she had been commanded to turn over the Israelite spies, but she refused to do so and thus resisted the authority over her in doing that. Other examples we could talk about, you know the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. In the book of Daniel, they are commanded to worship the image of Nebuchadnezzar that he set up, and they refused to do so and were thrown into the fiery furnace as a result of their resistance to his command. And of course, the Lord delivered them from death on that occasion, showing that they clearly acted in faith and did what was right by refusing the king's command. Daniel himself does something similar in chapter 6 of Daniel when there is an edict from the king, now this time the Medo-Persian king, that commands that no one can pray except to the king for a period of 30 days. And Daniel continued his daily practice of kneeling by his window facing toward Jerusalem, and he would pray 3 times a day. And so he openly and willfully resisted the king's edict there. And so there's another resistance to authority story. And of course, Daniel is held up as an example there after he's thrown into the lion's den, but the Lord delivers him. We could point to numerous other examples, but one more from the New Testament. and that is in the book of Acts. In Acts chapter 5, the apostles have been preaching in the name of Jesus. And starting in verse 27, we read, "And when they had brought them," that is, the Sanhedrin brought the apostles before them, "they set them before the council, and the high priest questioned them, saying, 'We strictly charged you not to teach in this name, yet here you have filled Jerusalem with your teaching, and you intend to bring this man's blood upon us.' But Peter and the apostles answered, 'We must obey God rather than men.'" And so they kept on preaching in the name of Jesus, and they kept on leading the church in spite of the command from the Sanhedrin not to do so. So we have the Hebrew midwives commanded to commit murder, Rahab commanded to turn over the Israelite spies, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego commanded to worship an image, Daniel commanded not to pray to the God of Israel but to the king, and Peter and the apostles commanded to stop preaching the gospel. And in every case, the principle seems to be this: resistance to authority is legitimate when it is for the purpose of obeying God. That is, God's authority is higher than all human authority, and when obeying God requires disobeying earthly authorities, then you obey God and not men. But you must be prepared to endure the consequences that come with that. And so you have potential punishment that may be put upon you by earthly authorities for disobeying them, and that's something you simply have to accept if it is the Lord's will for you to endure it. Now, the Lord may deliver you, as he did in some of these stories, but you do have to be prepared to accept the consequences, and yet it is still morally legitimate and even required that in obeying God it is necessary to disobey or resist earthly authority. Then, of course, you must resist the earthly authority. Now, how this plays out in actual Christian life. Christians have been imprisoned, beaten, put to death for godly resistance to governing authorities. That's happened throughout church history. Persecution, sometimes official persecution from governing authorities, is a reality that we live with in this fallen world and is something that Christians have endured for centuries and continue to endure today. And it is good and right that Christians should suffer as even martyrs for the sake of obedience to Christ rather than obedience to an earthly authority that is telling them not to obey God. How this might play out in another setting. What if you're a wife and your husband, who does have authority over you, has, as I mentioned a few weeks ago, the authority of influence, if he tries to assert an authority to tell you as a wife, you cannot go to church, the wife should resist him on that. He does not have that authority from God. He cannot forbid his wife from going to church. She must obey God. And if that means telling her husband, "You don't have authority to tell me that," then so be it. But that's another example of how that might play out in real life. Or what if you're an employee and your boss tells you that you have to violate your own conscience about something? Let's say your company is celebrating Pride Month and he wants you to put up a rainbow flag at your desk or something of that nature. You can imagine that that's probably an all too common scenario these days, or something like it in many workplaces. What should you as an employee do? You should be prepared to resist. Yes, he is your boss, and his authority is to be respected, and you are to submit to his authority in the workplace as your general posture. And yet, when it comes to actions that would cause you not to obey the Lord, then you do need to draw a line and say, no, I must resist here, and I must pursue other avenues. And if it involves getting fired, then so be it. But there are certainly other avenues you could perhaps pursue, with options of protesting what's going on at the workplace or filing paperwork with human resources, something like that. But an employee should not be required to violate his or her own conscience in an act such as that. Now, what about in a situation like the American Revolution from 1776? We just celebrated 250 years of the birth of a nation. And is it legitimate that the American founders resisted the authority of King George III and declared independence from him, and then went to war with him in order to solidify that independence? Well, here I think, evaluating that morally, hinges on the doctrine of what is called the lesser magistrate. So think of a magistrate as being greater or lesser. So King George was the greater magistrate, but here in America at that time, there were lesser magistrates. There were regional representatives. There was the Continental Congress. And the lesser magistrates regarded it as their duty to protect their people from tyranny that was coming from the greater magistrate. John Calvin writes about this at the very end of his Institutes of the Christian Religion. And he says this, "For if there are now any magistrates of the people appointed to restrain the willfulness of kings, I am so far from forbidding them to withstand, in accordance with their duty, the fierce licentiousness of kings, that if they wink at kings who violently fall upon and assault the lowly common folk, I declare that their dissimulation involves nefarious perfidy, because they dishonestly betray the freedom of the people, of which they know that they have been appointed protectors by God's ordinance." Now, perhaps that wasn't a helpful quote because Calvin's vocabulary is so thick at times, but what he is saying here is that he does not forbid resistance to authority when it comes from a lesser magistrate who is protecting his people from the abuses of a higher authority, namely a king. So if a king is imposing tyranny on his people, those who are under the king but still have some authority have a duty to protect their people insofar as they're able from that king's oppression. And so this is a situation where you can have two authorities clashing, the lesser magistrate clashing with the greater magistrate, but he's doing so out of his moral responsibility to protect those under his authority. And I believe that is really more the situation what's going on in the American Revolution. King George III had become a tyrant, and thus it was the duty of those who had authority here in, at that time, the colonies and then what became the states. They had a duty to protect their people from that tyranny, and that is what they did when they declared independence from Great Britain. Now, this only happened after repeated appeals to the king were ignored, and the colonists then acted in what was a very radical act of declaring their independence from the king's jurisdiction. Now, it is called the American Revolution, but it wasn't a revolution in the sense that it was destroying society completely and rebuilding it. It was actually more of an act of preserving the order of society because the king was the one acting outside the bounds. And so the colonists were the ones who were preserving a way of life that they had here from his tyrannical actions. It was an attempt to preserve an inherited moral order, and it's ever since America has been built on this moral order that we inherited from British society. Now, this is very different from the French Revolution that happened just a few years later in 1789. The French Revolution was very much a revolution in the sense that it was a tearing down of the structures of society, an attempt to rebuild something completely new, and it was a very humanist kind of act. It did not appeal to God, to providence. You notice how the Declaration of Independence speaks of the Creator and the rights that we have from Him, and how governments are instituted to protect those rights. The French Revolution's of a very different character, and it involved a much more radical kind of action. So it may not best be called the American Revolution. Whatever you call it, though, it was very different in character from the French. And so I would see the American resistance to tyranny as a legitimate moral act carried out by lesser magistrates who were maintaining order in their society by preserving it from the tyranny of King George. So, yes, there are occasions when resistance to authority, I think, is morally required of us as individuals, namely when an authority is requiring that we disobey God. And then there are occasions when the greater authority, the greater magistrate, may overstep his bounds in terms of the authority that he thinks he has. He may be acting in ways that are illegitimate for his position, and it falls then upon the lesser magistrates to restrain him by protecting their people from his tyranny. So lesser magistrates should act to defend those under their authority. How might this play out in our day? God forbid, but let's say another pandemic occurred sometime in the future. We all remember 2020 and the COVID pandemic and how crazy a time that was, and some of the things that governments apparently are willing to do, which was quite shocking to learn at the time. Well, let's say another one occurred at some point in the future, and this time the federal government declared a nationwide lockdown for 6 months. I would have thought that was insane prior to 2020, and yet I saw in 2020 some, at least state and local governments, doing that basic thing, declaring a full lockdown that lasted for months and months and months, and even, it seems in some places, for over a year. And I was simply astonished how long some places stayed locked down or restricted. Well, let's say the federal government says the whole nation must be locked down for 6 months. No gatherings of more than 12 people, whatever number they want to pick. Businesses must be closed, and we're going to functionally shut down society for 6 months. If that happened, I would consider that an abuse of authority on the part of the federal government. And so I would expect the governor of my state of Tennessee to declare that Tennessee will not comply, that Tennessee is not going to play along with this tyrannical game. That's what governors must be prepared to do in situations that might resemble that one. Or perhaps in some cases, local officials need to be prepared to do that in the face of higher-ups telling them certain actions must be taken that are oppressive to their people. Now, at some point, if you carry this lesser magistrate doctrine far enough, it is conceivable that a situation could escalate to the point of even secession, which happened with the American Revolution. The colonies declared we are no longer under the authority of the king. We are independent. And so they seceded from Great Britain and formed their own states that were united as one union of states. And that might lead to war. In the American Revolution, it certainly did. It led to war, and it's conceivable that there could be another situation that could lead to war in the future as a result of escalation to that point. And in that case, just war theory applies. And a just war includes the requirement of a legitimate authority to engage in war. So the reason I go through all that is because, yes, there are times when authority must be resisted, but that's not something that any group of people ought to set out to do willy-nilly. Sometimes I hear people talk about civil war or secession as though they're almost salivating at the prospect of doing it. And that's really not a good way to think about that. That would be a terrible thing to have to go through. And past generations went through it, and it was terrible. And it would be terrible to go through anything like that again. We should not want that to happen, and we should not assume that is something that can simply be declared by any handful of people gathered somewhere. If there's going to be some action like that, it would have to be from a lesser magistrate leading a movement of resistance that ultimately results in secession from an authority and then perhaps causing a war to resolve the dispute between them. Let's hope that never happens again. But if it does, there are moral principles involved in how we should resist and then how we should conduct war if that were to become ever necessary. But I do think we live in a day when we need to especially press upon our governors to think about their authority over their states as being of primary importance. The federal government has gotten too powerful, too big, and we live in a society, a union of states that is really an experiment in various forms of order. The states are to be laboratories of democracy, doing things their own ways in many respects, and the federal government doesn't have to regulate everything and impose uniform standards on everything. And so as states, we need to have freedom. That's called the idea of federalism. We need to have freedom to operate according to our own rules and regulations in many cases. And so governors of the states need to see their role in that, and we need to expect our governors to carry that out well. And if it ever comes to a point of resistance that is morally necessary, I hope that the governor of my state and of your state too is ready to take the stand that must be taken. Thankfully, I don't think we're in a situation like that now, but if the day were ever to come, I hope we've thought about it in advance. If you benefited from our podcast, would you consider subscribing on your favorite app? Leave us a 5-star review, and most importantly, share this podcast with a friend who could benefit from listening. If you would like to submit a question for our monthly Q&A episode, then you can go to the oldroadspodcast.com and submit the question there, as well as signing up to become a patron if you'd like to support us financially. And thank you to all our patrons. Until next time, remember, Jeremiah 6:16, thus says the Lord, stand by the roads and look and ask for the ancient paths where the good way is and walk in it and find rest for your souls.